Evolution of the Wisdom of the Body. A presentation by Professor Gershom Zajcek, Faculty of Medicine, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Introduction. What is life and what keeps me alive? Two vital questions which medicine loves to evade. It pretends that it understands what keeps me alive. In reality, it bluffs. In several presentations, I showed that our non-conscious, which I call wisdom of the body, keeps us alive and we don't know how. For several years, I have been studying the non-conscious and intend to describe its evolution. Yet first, I ought to define what I mean by the term non-conscious, which requires to define also who am I. Two realms operate in my body. One, which I call mind, includes all that I am conscious of in myself, like awareness of myself, my feelings, thoughts, and my will. The other realm, called wisdom of the body or WOB, is non-conscious. It includes all processes in my body which I am not aware of. In short, mind stands for my consciousness, wisdom of the body or WOB stands for my non-consciousness. For instance, I decide to raise my hand. Mind, I know or remember that I can raise my hand. WOB, I know and remember how to raise my hand, which is unconscious. When my hand rises, special sense organs in the WOB realm inform me, the mind, about the hand position. I apply these two metaphors to define and analyze medically relevant phenomena in the body, like in the following presentation. Two presentations on the wisdom of the body, then neurological dimension of mind and WOB, suffering and WOB, medical dimension of mysticism and spirituality, which depend on WOB, Kabbalah and WOB, then art of archery and WOB, and Daniel Tammet's WOB. These are in the following link. WOB keeps me alive and handles my health and disease. It heals my so-called self-healing diseases. Medicine does not understand how WOB keeps me alive and how it heals my self-healing diseases. I therefore regard WOB as a non-linear black box with inputs and outputs. These are messages between mind and WOB which I described in other presentations. WOB has two properties. It is extremely complex and it is optimal. You might say, while complexity I can somehow grasp, optimality beats me. I shall therefore explain what optimality means to me and how it evolved. In his book, The Phenomenon of Life, Hans Jonas wrote, "The mind is prefigured throughout the organic existence." Jonas shows how life forms present themselves on an ascending scale of perception and freedom of action. Mind evolves in this ascending scale. I apply this approach to WOB. WOB is prefigured throughout organic existence. It is an attribute of all live entities and evolved from a proto-WOB of a single cell organism to our WOB, which operates in our non-conscious. Let's start with the protobulb of an amoeba and study one of its ingredients, a protein. We take this protein and treat it with various solutions, and it responds with different conformation. Physical reasoning teaches that when facing a challenge, perturbation, protein will settle or choose a conformation which minimizes its energy expenditure. This is a protein optimality. Now imagine the following experiment. You put one protein molecule in a solution. For some time it will twist and finally will settle at a conformation. This graph depicts all conformations that protein displays until it stops changing. The final state is the optimal conformation for this particular protein in a particular solution. Here, energy utilization defines optimality. The graph on the left displays protein conformation from the beginning of the experiment until it stops changing. The right graphs display the energy required for each conformation in the left graph. Protein will settle at a conformation which requires minimum energy to sustain. This is its most optimal conformation. We repeat this experiment for solution ABC and determine the optimal protein conformation in each. We put protein A in a solution and wait until it stops changing, and point A on the graph is the final conformation of A, and so the other points. The graph displays stable or most optimal conformation for each protein in these solutions, ABC. Now, this diagram on the left represents the conformation of three protein molecules and their context in yellow. Conformation of each depends on the conformations of the other two and the solution in which they exist. When placed in a solution, their conformation will evolve toward a minimum when the system stops changing. So what you see here in this Venn diagram, you have three proteins, A, B, C. Whenever they interact, this is their context. And there's another context, is a solution in which these three proteins exist. And when you start the experiment, this system settles down with time, like in this curve. Now imagine an amoeba. The context of each protein consists of the fluid in which it exists, as well as of all other proteins in the amoeba, like the scheme shows. So amoeba optimization depends on the optimization of its proteins, their interaction, and the fluid in which they exist. Now amoeba can handle its optimization by modifying its fluid using a membrane pump. Here, this is the membrane pump, an ACL pump. Let's say that amoeba's survival depends on its efficiency to handle energy. In the next experiment, you put amoeba in a container whose solution consists of an NaCl gradient to the left. In order to optimize conformation of its proteins, amoeba has to maintain an optimal NaCl concentration. When its NaCl is too high, it will pump it out and vice versa, which requires energy. So here you have the container with a gradient, And here you have the pump. You observe the amoeba. Initially, it flows erratically in the container. After a while, it flows in circles around a certain location where it, so-called, feels comfortable. It found a location where the conformation of its proteins is optimal and it feels good. Let's analyze what has occurred. As amoeba floats around, it will settle at an ACL concentration which requires minimal NaCl pumping and maximizes its optimality. We may thus describe its behavior as follows. Amoeba feels how optimal it is, and O sub I. It remembers its current position in the container, which is S sub I. It remembers its previous position, Si minus 1, and optimality, OI minus 1. It compares its current optimality, OI with OI minus 1. If optimality now is smaller than the previous optimality, it returns to its previous place, Si minus 1. Otherwise, it continues. Since amoeba feels its optimality, it associates each position with its feelings, which I mentioned before. It remembers its previous position and optimality, which means that it remembers its previous associations between the two. So we have the association, which is defined as the state where the amoeba is and its optimality, and it compares AI minus 1 with AI which is now with the previous AI minus 1. If optimality is less than the previous optimality, it returns to Si sub I minus 1. Otherwise, it continues. So we are dealing here with an instinct which is called the association instinct, which the amoeba applies to decide how to proceed. It operates in all life forms. So let's generalize this statement a little. Amoeba remembers the previous association between its optimality and the context in which it exists. So everything which is not amoeba, or everything which influences amoeba, is called context, and amoeba is searching for the most optimal optimality in a given context with this context pump. Context pump means she eliminates all elements which increase her optimality, decrease her optimality at a given state. So here you have again the generalization. We have the context in and out, and we have a context pump. Some amoeba properties which we can deduce from this experiment which I described. A self separated from the outside by a membrane. Amoeba feels its optimality. It has a memory which is embodied in its structure, or the proteins. It is a parallel memory. Amoeba remembers the association between context and its optimality, the context association instinct. And amoeba acts to restore optimality when context changes, and then it maintains optimal homeostasis. This thought experiment is one-dimensional example of optimality. In reality, amoeba optimality is determined by many factors. Its structure and context are multidimensional. No computer, even the most powerful, can solve how this ensemble optimizes. Only life knows it, and we take it therefore as an attribute of life, a law of living entities. The organism, here's the law, optimality law. The organism responds optimally to any challenge. When facing a challenge, the organism searches for a solution that maximizes its survival or minimizes here its optimality. At any circumstance, the organism creates the most optimal solution in order to survive. This principle governs all life and is manifested by homeostasis, equilibrium. In any circumstance, homeostasis is optimal. You may console yourself with the fact that also physics bases its laws on a phenomenon which they don't understand, gravity. So we are not alone. Now you grasp what I mean that amoeba has a web. Amoeba web is a set of processes in the amoeba and their mutual control. It is a non-linear black box with inputs and outputs. In the experiment we observed only amoeba's input, which was the context, and output, which was its behavior. We are not concerned how web optimizes, because we cannot grasp it and describe it. We observed solely its output and sometimes input. Everything else is interpretation with metaphors, like web feels its optimality. We have to communicate this feature. Your web has the same properties like the amoeba. A self, separated from the outside by membrane, which is your skin. The web feels its optimality. If you feel healthy, you are optimal. Web has a memory embodied in its structure, proteins. It is a parallel memory. It remembers the association between context and its optimality. And web acts to restore optimality when context changes it. And then web maintains optimal homeostasis. While amoeba is a pure web, we got also a mind, the site of our free will. So let's again define it. Mind stands for my consciousness. Web stands for my non-consciousness. Communication between mind and web is described elsewhere. Conditioning exploits the association instinct and influences also web. Conditioning is a manipulation of a first person context by a third person. Simply stated, conditioning is a manipulation of me by somebody else. Pavlov trained his dog to salivate whenever it heard a ringing bell. Training established an association between bell ringing and meat supply, which is called conditioning. There are two kinds of conditioning. Mind conditioning, which we usually call suggestion, and verb conditioning. So mind communicates with verb with imagination. When you think of a steak, you actually imagine it, which is a message to verb to activate salivation. When somebody describes to you a juicy steak, you imagine it. The message is sent to verb for execution. Unperceiving, you start to salivate by a minute amount. You react to suggestion, which is a conditioning of a mind. Suggestion creates in your mind an image which is transmitted to verb. As a child, you were conditioned to associate juicy steak with its image, which activates verb for execution. And so you were taught many other things. The same applies to Pavlov's conditioning, which is suggestive. When a trained dog observed Pavlov, his conscious mind reminded him to expect a meat meal, whereupon he wagged his tail. Watching Pavlov, the dog imagined the expected meat, and this image activated verb. Dog's behavior thus suggests that he has a mind and imagines like you or me. You might ask whether Pavlov might condition also a mindless dog in a coma, which I call verb conditioning. Imagine that with an anesthetic drug you silence dog's mind and consciousness, and he sinks into a state of a non-conscious coma. Then you train the non-conscious dog as Pavlov did and expect that the result will be the same. You established an association between bell ringing and verb response, which is not mediated through the mind, and I call it verb conditioning. Verb does not rely on conscious mind in order to hear the bell. It has its own dedicated channel directly into the non-conscious. All our sensations are conveyed to mind and verb in parallel. One reaches the consciousness and the other is non-conscious. Therefore, remember, a verb of a patient in coma listens and medicine ignores it. Pavlov would never have trained or conditioned a comatose dog, neither medicine, which ignores the non-conscious verb and its enormous potential. For instance, verb conditioning may speed up coma recovery, which I intend to discuss in another presentation. It remained for Eric Kandel to condition a mindless verb of a snail called Aplysia. He was interested only in the nervous system, but Aplysia is a mindless verb which Kandel conditioned in various ways, and you can deduce what would be the response of the mindless dog in coma. Interim summary. I started with the association instinct which operates in any life form. Conditioning is a manipulated non-natural association. And there are two kinds of conditioning: mind conditioning, which we call suggestion, and verb conditioning, which is totally unconscious. Mind is conditioned by our culture. Here are some examples of mind conditioning: learning to talk, read, and write, education, manners, or how we think and reason. All these are conditioned by our culture, and I call it also suggestion. All our thoughts are conditioned. We think in images which are transmitted to verb. Verb remembers all the associations between a thought and its action and activates non-conscious processes accordingly. When you read, the text is translated into images, which you either see or hear. The association between text and image was conveyed to you by mind conditioning or suggestion, generally by our culture. When reading a sad story, its image is transmitted to verb, which activates sad emotion and tears. Culture conditioning drives the placebo effect, which I discuss elsewhere. Nocebo medicine, as an example. Culture conditioning drives also nocebo medicine. You visit your oncologist, who adheres to patient autonomy. He tells you that your cancer markers are dangerously high. You imagine the oncoming death. Verb lessens and weakens your healing processes. This is nocebo conditioning. Summary. I described the evolution of optimality. It is an evolution of an optimal verb which relies on the association instinct. Hans Jonas described the evolution of the mind. The human mind is conditioned by our culture and interferes with verb optimality, which I discussed in other presentation. That's all.